Hey everyone, I'm Mickey and this is everything I read in 2023. I read 52 books last year. 50 books is kind of my usual yearly goal or my average. A lot of it was manga, and I think next year I definitely want to read more classics. There are like a few in particular that I've been meaning to get around to for the last couple of years, so those are at the top of my list. I just turned 24 last month, but I already feel like I'm running out of time to read all the books that I want to. So in 2024, I'm going to be more proactive about having a richer reading year. So with all that being said, let's look back at 2023. I'm going to go through this month by month and also give you the rating that I gave the book and a short review if I have anything to say about the book. And at the end, I will share my top 5 reads in 5 different categories. So yeah, let's begin. In January, I read 4 books, and the very first book of the year was The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I'm not like on Book Talk or BookTube that much, so I don't really keep up with all the popular books, but even I had heard about this one, and I think it lived up to the hype. I think it was good that I went into this knowing nothing about the story, so the plot twists were a surprise to me. I very rarely read contemporary fiction, so I'm really glad that I started off with this book and ended up really enjoying it. The second book that I read was 20th Century Boys, the 5th volume of the Perfect Edition by Naoki Urasawa. Solid manga, solid series, and I'm looking forward to keep reading. Next, I read Part 1, Volume 1 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure by Hirohiko Araki. I'm reading and collecting this manga from the start because as an anime fan, I am starved for content. Obviously, the beginning is a little slow, which is why it's a 3-star, but I'm still looking forward to continuing on with the rest of the series. Last for January, I read The Long Valley by John Steinbeck. This is a collection of short stories, and I really liked The Chrysanthemums and The Red Pony. Overall, a solid read from one of my favorite authors. In February, I read 4 books, and the first was this one-shot manga called My Broken Mariko by Waka Hirako. This was a manga I've been meaning to get around to. I love when I can find like a 1-volume manga. And as you probably get from the title, it's a story about a woman who loses her close friend Mariko through really like sad, unfortunate circumstances, and how she deals with that loss. And it was a very good manga, good art, and made me cry. Next was Memories of My Melancholy Horrors by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I like Garcia Marquez's writings. I don't really like the themes of his stories. So I think this was as expected, so 3 stars. And then my first poetry read of the year was 100 Poets, One Poem Each, which is a collection of Japanese poetry. Each poem is by a different prominent Japanese poet. I was really excited about this, but I think most of the poems didn't touch me as much as I wanted them to. Maybe it has something to do with the translation, but there are a few that stood out to me, so I think this was solid enough to give it like a little bit more than a 3-star. Next, I read The Netanyahus by Joshua Cohen. I know way too little about Judaism or Zionism to really have any thoughts about this book. It definitely felt like an intellectual read. There were definitely parts that were entertaining, and I think I got to learn a little about the Jewish American experience, so 3.5 stars. In March, I read 2 books, and the first one was Waiting by Ha Jin. This tells the story of star-crossed lovers set in China during the Cultural Revolution. And I was really loving this book until, spoiler plus trigger warning, there was a pretty graphic scene of sexual assault that I think added nothing to the story. I felt like it served no purpose and made me hate the book. Next was Volume 2 of Part 1 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Again, 3 stars. In April, I read 10 books, which a lot of that was just one manga series. But first was Volume 1 of this manga, which I think the English translated title is The Guy She Was Interested Wasn't a Guy at All. And this is by Sumiko Arai. This started off, I think, as a Twitter comic, but I think has since been printed into a physical edition. And man, I love queer stories in manga, and this is such a cute girls love. It avoids like all the weird cliches or tropes that are usually in Japanese manga when it comes to lesbian romances. So I'm glad we got to avoid that and got this really wholesome story about two high school students that are really into music and kind of connect in that way. The next read that took me quite a long time to finish was Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. I gave this 4 stars, but I will say that the way Ellison writes is very beautiful. It's literary wine. And I feel like Invisible Man is a novel so ahead of its time. It was published in 1952, and the main character is a Black man that is unnamed throughout the novel. And it kind of shows us the societal and racial conflicts that Black Americans were going through at this time, and it's still very relevant to today, unfortunately. The only reason I gave it a 4 star instead of like a 5 star is that it is quite long, and although the prose is beautiful, there are like pages and pages of monologues from various characters that makes the story drag on just a bit, just enough to not give it a 5 star. The next 8 books were volumes 1 through 8 of My Love Mix-Up, which is a story written by Wataru Hinekure and illustrated by Aruko. I gave this a 4 star, which is generally what I give all manga that I think is like a solid manga. This is like a cute boys love romance. I honestly cannot tell you what the plot is, don't remember what the characters are like at all, but I do remember it was very cute. In May, I read 5 books, and the first of that was another John Steinbeck, and that is his novel Tortilla Flat. If you didn't know, Steinbeck is my favorite author. This was a very solid read, pretty humorous, I think, just an enjoyable time. The next book I read, this is my 3rd or 4th reread, if not my 5th reread of this book. And that is A Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger? However you pronounce that. I think I read this at least 2 or 3 times in high school. The first time I liked it, the second time I didn't, and then the third time I think I had to read it for a class and I liked it again. I think it surprises me how much people dislike this book and dislike the main character, at least like from online discourse, even when I've graduated college and worked, and I'm a grad student now. But sort of those painful feelings of existing and trying to figure out the world and your place in the world. I don't know, I thought it was a very poignant read. The next 2 books I read were volume 1 and 2 of Ogi's Summer Break. This is such a good manga. I gave volume 1 a 4 star, but I gave volume 2 a 4.5 stars. But what really stood out to me was one of the characters in the relationship. Has a very interesting expression of himself and kind of has these certain thoughts about gender identity and gender expression through his clothing choices. Like, he likes to paint his nails, he likes to wear skirts, and it brings up interesting conversations about what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a boy in love with another boy. I just wasn't expecting those kind of topics to come up from this like cute romance. So I think it's pretty interesting. I'm excited to see where it goes further in the story. And then the last book I read in May was Alone with You in the Ether by Olivia Blake, I think. And now that I think about it, I don't think I've ever read a heterosexual romance in novel form. Like, yes, in anime, shows, movies, but I don't think I've ever picked up a straight romance before. I'm not opposed to it, I just haven't found one that has, struck my interest. I don't read much romance either. I prefer to get romance through my K-dramas and movies and such, but this was, I think, surprisingly good. In June, I read 3 books, and the first one was All the Lovers in the Night by Meiko Kawakami. I love this cover. This was a really interesting read. I would say it's kind of philosophical or psychological, And I think just the build up to the end was really satisfying. I mean, the ending did leave me a bit, it was a bit open-ended, or it was a bit not what I was expecting. A interesting conclusion to this whole novel, which has some really nice writing, and I'm looking forward to reading more from this author. Next book I read was In Limbo by J.G. Lee. This is, I believe, an autobiographical memoir graphic novel. As far as graphic novels go, one of the best ones I've read in a while. And the last book I read in June was Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. It did take me quite a while to get through it, even though I did like the writing. I found I wasn't in the mood most of the time to read it, but I think the concept of writing a whole novel based on one singular day, but of course we go into the minds of the characters and get their past through their memories and their reflections, is very interesting, and I applaud Virginia Woolf for executing that pretty well. Unfortunately, I did not read anything in July. That is another goal for 2024, is to read at least one book a month, because it kind of annoys me having this gap. But moving on to August, I read 7 books. The first was volume 14 of Blood on the Tracks by Shuzo Oshimi. I was really enjoying this series at the beginning, but I think this was the point where it was starting to taper off for me, which is why it's a 3-star. The next book was a collection of short stories that were kind of tied together, and the name is That Time I Loved You by Carrie Ann Lung. Then I read volumes 1 through 4 of Sasaki and Miyano by Sho Harusono. Correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this is getting an anime adaptation, which is why I must have read it a bit forgettable as a manga, but nothing bad about it, just your average BL. The last book I read was Animal Farm by George Orwell. I think at this point I felt I was like finding it hard to get back into reading, and that I was reading too much manga just to rack up my completed book count, which is why I reread Animal Farm after all this time. 3.5 stars. In September, I read 5 books, the first 3 being volumes 15 through 17 of Blood on the Tracks, and this was to finish off the series. As an average, I gave these 2.75 stars. I can't even say that I disliked the ending, it's more that the ending was dragged on for so long. I felt like the story could have ended many volumes back in a much more satisfactory way. Next, I read volume 1 of the manga Dry Run in Nishi Ogikubo by Ringo Yuki. This is about a girl who, fresh out of high school, wants to become an animator. Kind of a fun story. It was pretty interesting. 3.75 stars. And the last book in September was Strike Your Heart by Amélie Nothomb. This is a really interesting, very short novel about a dysfunctional mother-daughter relationship where the mother seems to have no heart and no affection whatsoever towards most people, but especially not towards her daughter, which comes in the contrast when she has a son later on and then another daughter later on, and seems to love those children with all her heart. In October, I read 3 books, the first being volume 9 of My Love Mix-Up. This might have been the last volume of that series, so I was just finishing it up. And then the next 2 books were books for class, so it's getting to the time of year where scraping by. First was Perilous Bounty by Tom Philpott, and the third one was Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. In November, I read 5 books. The first was volume 2 of Dry Run in Nishi Ogikubo. The next novel I read was Disoriental. I don't want to mispronounce the author's name, so here it is. Pretty solid read, very interesting, sort of semi-biographical on the account of the author and her family leaving Iran and ending up in France. And the next book I read was Blue is the Warmest Color by Jules Marot. Man, I've been meaning to read this graphic novel for a while. I had known about the film adaptation for many, many years. I think as all queer youth on Tumblr circa 2013 know. I had known someone who happened to have it, so I borrowed it and finally got to read it. Definitely problematic at some parts, so 4 stars. The next book I read was You, Me, Montgomery, and Everything That Happened in Between by Loretta Blue. I was doing the Zine Fest in Portland, and I saw a stack of these had been left after the event, so I'm not sure what had happened, if these are a misprint or something and people had left them. So I got this for free. I think this is like a self-published book. Kind of reads like long-form poetry. It's a bit like train of thought. Then lastly, in November, I read Solanin by Inio Asano. Very solid story. Of course, beautiful artwork from this author. And much less depressing than what I'm used to from the author. In December, I read 4 books, and the first was the graphic novel Tekkon Kincrete by Taiyo Matsumoto. This was the complete edition. I gave this 3.75 stars. I think the beginning was quite confusing, and I had the urge to Google like the whole story synopsis to understand what was happening, but I fought that urge and kept reading, and eventually I kind of understood what was happening, and a little rough around the edges, but it was a solid read. Next I read is Love the Answer by Uta Isaki. Very solid read. I haven't read a manga about asexuality before, and I think this was a really good way of portraying it. Solid characters, interesting relationships, and I do really recommend this manga. The next was the last graphic novel of the year, which was It's Lonely at the Center of the Earth by Zoe Thorogood. And I did give this a 4 stars. I just appreciate how creative the art is with the paneling and the page layout. And the author says it themselves in the story, but it is a very self-aware book, and they even critique themselves in the story about being too self-aware. I felt like it was calling back to itself a bit too much, which is why it's a 4 star, but overall very good. And lastly, I read another Taylor Jenkins read to close off the year, and that was Carrie Soto is Back. 3.5 stars. Since I don't really read contemporary fiction, I feel like Taylor Jenkins Reid I have to praise her for getting me into it. The way this story read it was very easy to read. Very enjoyable to get through the pages, but the way it read sort of felt like I was reading a fan fiction of another story, if that makes sense. Tell me if anyone else has felt this way reading this book, or maybe that's the vibe of contemporary fiction in general. So those were all the 52 books I read in 2023, and I'm going to give you my top 5 in 5 different categories. First, for popular fiction, I'm going to give this award to The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I think it deserves the praise it's gotten. A very solid book. For classics, I'm going to give this to The Catcher in the Rye. The Catcher in the Rye is a story of the human condition and the story of adolescence, and adolescence kind of being ripped away from you as you start to enter into the adult world. I think it's worth being taught in schools, and I think I will be rereading it in a couple years down the line. For literary fiction, I'm going to give this to All the Lovers in the Night. I think when you start to read this book, you will instantly be drawn in by the way the character is talking about the dredges of going through the motions of everyday life and what it means to want to have a connection with someone else. For manga, I'm going to recommend The Guy She Was Interested In Wasn't a Guy at All, and that's because when I read it, I was just instantly in love with this story and the characters and just the wholesome vibe of it all. Also, the artwork is amazing. For graphic novels, this award goes to In Limbo. I always think autobiographies in graphic form are not only accessible to everyone, but really brings out the best out of the comic form. So those are all my reads of 2023. Let me know what your favorite reads of 2023 was, and I look forward to reading more in the new year. Bye!